The voice on the emergency call was calm. Too calm. Not panicked. Not hysterical. Not even emotional. Just a man speaking in a flat, detached tone to a police dispatcher while somewhere behind him, inside a silent apartment in East Kilbride, a young woman's body was already beginning to decompose. I think I killed my girlfriend. For a moment, the operator thought she had misheard him. There was no screaming in the background. No chaos. No urgency. Only breathing. Slow. Controlled. Almost relaxed. Then the man spoke again. I had some sort of psychotic break. The words hung in the air with a chilling emptiness, like he was describing a bad dream instead of the destruction of a human life. Outside, November rain battered the streets of Scotland as police vehicles cut through the darkness toward a quiet residential block on Glenlee. Blue lights flashed across rows of sleeping apartments. Most residents had no idea that, just a few meters away, officers were about to walk into one of the most horrifying crime scenes many of them would ever witness. The building itself looked ordinary. Top floor flat, dim hallway, beige walls. The kind of place thousands of couples live in across Britain. Safe, forgettable, quiet. Nothing about it suggested evil. But experienced detectives would later say that some scenes announce themselves before you even step inside. This was one of them. Officers forced entry into the apartment shortly after midday. The smell hit first. Rotting flesh, metallic blood, damp air trapped inside seal rooms for nearly 2 days. Then silence, an unnatural silence. No television, no movement, no voices, just the sound of boots crossing the floor as officers carefully moved deeper into flat. The hallway was streaked with blood, not splatters, smears. Drag patterns. Something terrible had happened here, something violent enough to stain nearly every surface in sight. Then one officer noticed a towel. A single towel lying awkwardly across the narrow hallway floor. Underneath it was a body, or what remained of one. 21-year-old Phoenix Spencerhorn had been mutilated so severely that even hardened investigators reportedly struggled to process what they were seeing. Her body had been stabbed repeatedly. Her throat cut, parts of her dismembered. Nearby, 2 blood-covered knives rested on the floor beside her remains. A third knife waited in the bathroom sink, still wet. And then came the detail that transformed this from a horrific killing into something psychologically monstrous. Phoenix had not died that morning. She had been dead for 2 days. 2 full days. For 48 hours, while her body lay hidden inside that apartment, her killer walked freely through the city. He drove her car, used her phone, bought food, searched pornography for hours. And all the while, he pretended she was still alive. Investigators would later uncover messages sent from Phoenix's phone to her mother. Casual texts, loving texts, tiny fragments of fake normality carefully designed to stop anyone from becoming suspicious. Sorry, just woke up XXX. Except Phoenix never sent them. She was already dead when those messages arrived. Her mother had been unknowingly texting the man who murdered her daughter. And detectives quickly realized something even more disturbing. This was not the behavior of someone confused or disconnected from reality. This was organized, controlled, calculated. The killer had not immediately confessed. He had delayed, hidden evidence, manipulated people, maintained the illusion that nothing was wrong, which raised a terrifying question. If he was calm enough to impersonate her for 2 days, what exactly had happened inside that apartment? Because investigators would soon discover this wasn't simply an explosion of rage. It was something darker, something deeply disturbing hiding beneath the surface of what once appeared to be a perfectly normal relationship. Before she became a crime scene, before detectives spoke her name in briefing rooms, before newspapers reduced her life to headlines about brutality and horror, Phoenix Spencerhorn was simply the kind of person people felt safe around. The kind who remembered birthdays without reminders. The kind who checked if you got home safely. The kind who could walk into a room carrying everyone else's pain and still somehow leave people smiling. Friends would later struggle to describe her without crying, not because they were trying to dramatize her memory, but because almost every memory of Phoenix felt painfully alive, warm, bright, Human. She was only 21 years old, an age where most people still believe the future is endless. And Phoenix believed in the future more than most. She believed in love, in loyalty, in second chances, in people. That was part of what made what happened to her feel so unbearable. People who grow up around violence often learn to distrust the world early. Phoenix was the opposite. She moved through life with an openness that made others feel instantly comfortable around her. Family members describe her as emotionally intuitive, the person who could sense sadness before anyone spoke a word. As a child, she hated seeing people excluded. If someone sat alone, Phoenix sat beside them. If someone was hurting, she wanted to fix it. Her mother would later say she carried softness into every room she entered. And nowhere was that bond stronger than with her mom, Allison. They weren't just close. They were inseparable. They spoke constantly, shared everything. Tiny daily updates most people would ignore somehow became rituals between them. Voice notes, random selfies, check-in texts throughout the day. A normal message from Phoenix could be as simple as, "Love you, XXX." And Allison always answered. Always. That routine would later become one of the most haunting parts of the entire case. Because when those messages suddenly stopped feeling normal, it meant something was already terribly wrong. Growing up in Scotland, Phoenix dreamed about building a life filled with movement and excitement. She loved hospitality work because it matched her personality perfectly. Fast-paced environments, constant conversation, making people feel welcome. Co-workers remember her smile first, then her energy, then her ability to make complete strangers feel like friends within minutes. She worked long shifts without complaining, covered for co-workers, stayed late when needed. Customers remembered her because she treated people like they mattered. There was a gentleness to her that didn't feel performative. It felt real. And online, her life looked exactly the way young love is supposed to look. Photos laughing with friends, videos singing in cars, late-night snapshots with the man she believed she would spend her future with. You and Methan. To outsiders, they looked solid, comfortable, happy, the kind of couple people scroll past online and quietly envy. 2 years together. Shared apartment, shared routines, shared future. Phoenix posted affectionate captions about him, called him her soulmate, talked about how much brighter life felt with him in it, and he blended into her world effortlessly. That's what made him dangerous. There were no obvious warning signs in the beginning, no dramatic explosions, no visible violence. Her family welcomed him completely, trusted him, invited him into holidays, dinners, private moments. He looked ordinary, quiet, polite, dependable, the type of man nobody fears, which is exactly why cases like this terrify investigators so deeply, because real predators rarely introduce themselves as monsters. Sometimes they become part of the family first. Sometimes they spend years learning exactly how to appear safe. And Phoenix, like so many victims trapped inside psychologically manipulative relationships, interpreted emotional dependency as love. Small comments didn't seem alarming at first. He missed her when she worked late. He wanted more time together. He became upset when she wasn't home. On the surface, it sounded romantic, intense, passionate, even, but hidden underneath was something darker beginning to take shape. Possession, control disguised as vulnerability, the subtle shifting of emotional responsibility onto her shoulders. And because Phoenix was naturally empathetic, she responded the way caring people often do. She apologized, even when she had done nothing wrong. That pattern would quietly repeat itself behind closed doors, while smiling photos continued appearing online, which raises a question detectives would later obsess over. How many dangerous relationships look completely normal from the outside? Because the final images of Phoenix's life are painfully ordinary. A young woman laughing, working, texting her mother, making plans for the future, loving someone she believed loved her back. Nothing about those moments suggested she was living beside a man capable of unimaginable violence. Nothing suggested that only hours later, the apartment they share would become a place of mutilation, bloodshed, and death. And perhaps the cruelest part of all, Phoenix never stopped trusting him. not even at the very end. Because behind the smiling photographs and affectionate messages, something dangerous had already begun growing in silence. Ewan Methin did not look dangerous. That became one of the most unsettling parts of the entire investigation. When detectives first began reconstructing his life, they weren't staring at the profile of a violent career criminal. There were no prior convictions for brutality, no history of arrests that screamed escalation, no obvious trail leading toward murder. On paper, he looked painfully ordinary, 27 years old, quiet, employed as a postman, the type of man neighbors barely noticed. He delivered parcels, kept routines, blended into the background of daily life, so completely that people struggle to remember anything memorable about him at all. And predators who blend and are often the hardest to see coming. Phoenix's family trusted him because there initially seemed to be no reason not to. He attended dinners, shared jokes, sat beside her during family gatherings like any loving boyfriend would. Nothing about his behavior triggered immediate alarm. If anything, he appeared reserved, slightly awkward, even safe. That word would later haunt the people who welcomed him into their lives. Because safety was exactly the illusion he perfected. Psychologists who study coercive relationships often describe a chilling pattern in emotionally controlling partners. Rarely do they begin with overt cruelty. Real manipulation tends to arrive slowly, almost invisibly, disguised as affection intense enough to feel flattering. At first, Ewan's attention seemed loving. He wanted to spend all his time with Phoenix. He texted constantly, asked where she was, who she was with, when she'd be home. To outsiders, especially young couples, that behavior can appear passionate rather than dangerous. Obsession masquerades as devotion. Possessiveness disguises itself as emotional vulnerability. And Phoenix, deeply empathetic by nature, responded the way caring people often do. She reassured him, again and again. But reassurance is addictive to controlling personalities. The more they receive, the more they demand. Investigators later uncovered patterns hidden beneath the surface of their relationship. Tiny shifts, small emotional manipulations that individually seemed insignificant, but together revealed something deeply unhealthy growing over time. If Phoenix worked late, he became withdrawn. If she spent time with friends, his mood changed. If she failed to reply quickly enough, tension followed, not explosive rage. Something colder. Guilt, silence, emotional punishment designed to make her feel responsible for his emotional state. That's what makes coercive control so psychologically devastating. There are often no bruises in the beginning, no visible signs for family members to immediately recognize. Instead, the victims slowly adapt their behavior to avoid conflict they cannot fully explain. They become careful with words, careful with timing, careful with independence, and eventually careful becomes normal. Friends would later remember subtle moments that felt strange in hindsight, Ewan appearing irritated when Phoenix received attention, watching conversations too closely, becoming unusually intense over minor misunderstandings. But hindsight changes everything. At the time, nobody saw a future killer. They saw a boyfriend. That contradiction sits at the center of so many horrifying cases, because society often imagines monsters as visibly broken people, aggressive strangers lurking in dark alleys, men who look violent before they become violent. But the truth detectives repeatedly encounter is far more disturbing. Many predators learn how to appear harmless long before they become dangerous, and Ewan seemed deeply invested in maintaining that image. There was another layer investigators found increasingly disturbing as they analyzed the relationship: emotional dependency. His identity appeared heavily attached to Phoenix. Her attention regulated his mood. Her presence stabilized him. Her absence affected him disproportionately. To emotionally healthy people, love adds meaning to life. To unstable personalities, love can begin feeling like ownership. That distinction matters, because ownership creates entitlement. And entitlement becomes dangerous the moment control feels threatened. The deeper detectives looked, the more they questioned whether Phoenix herself had started sensing something was wrong near the end of the relationship. Some reports suggested growing tension inside the apartment they shared, arguments becoming more frequent, emotional strain intensifying beneath the carefully curated image shown online. Yet, even then, there was no clear indication of what was coming. No visible warning that the quiet postman trusted by everyone around him was psychologically deteriorating behind closed doors, which raises a terrifying possibility. Where the final violence wasn't truly sudden at all. What if it had been silently building for months, hidden beneath apologies, affection, and manipulation so subtle nobody recognized it until it was too late? Experts in violent domestic homicide often point to a dangerous psychological crossroads. The moment a controlling partner begins fearing emotional abandonment, humiliation, or loss of dominance. That fear can trigger escalation, not because the victim has done something wrong, but because a controlling person experiences independence itself as betrayal. And sometime during those final days inside that apartment, something shifted inside you and Methan. Something dark enough to turn emotional dependency into catastrophic violence. The smiling photos still existed online. The affectionate messages still sat inside their phones. To the outside world, they still looked like a normal couple building a future together. But inside the apartment, the emotional atmosphere had already begun changing. Tension thickened. Silences lasted longer. Small arguments carried strange emotional weight. And Phoenix, kind, trusting, emotionally loyal Phoenix, was about to send the final genuine message of her life. Hours later, everything would descend into unimaginable horror. The final normal evening of Phoenix Spencer Horn's life began so quietly that nobody around her could have imagined how the night would end. That's what makes the timeline so haunting. Nothing looked catastrophic at first. No screaming heard through walls. No shattered windows. No desperate phone calls for help. Just another cold Scottish evening settling over East Kilbride while thousands of people returned home from work, ordered takeaway food, watched television, and prepared for tomorrow. Inside the apartment Phoenix shared with you and Methan, life initially appeared ordinary. Lights on, phones charging, dinner plans, routine, the kind of domestic normality investigators later found almost unbearable to reconstruct. Because every tiny detail became loaded with tragic meaning once they understood what was coming. Hours before her death, Phoenix was still messaging her mother. The text felt completely natural, warm, casual, loving. Nothing about them suggested fear. Nothing hinted she believed she was in danger. And that detail would later torture investigators psychologically, because it reinforced a devastating reality. Phoenix likely had no idea the man beside her was nearing a breaking point. At some stage that evening, the couple ordered takeaway food. Detectives would later piece together receipts, timestamps, and delivery records to reconstruct those final hours almost minute by minute. The food arrived at the apartment, while rain tapped softly against windows outside. Somewhere nearby, televisions glowed inside neighboring homes. An ordinary night. That contrast matters, because the most disturbing crimes often unfold in complete silence beside ordinary life. The delivery driver later recalled nothing unusual. No visible panic. No argument. No sign of violence waiting beneath the surface. Just a couple receiving food. One of them was already dead within hours. Investigators believe tension had likely been building internally between them long before that night. Small emotional fractures hidden behind routine. Conversations loaded with unresolved resentment. Psychological dependency slowly mutating into instability. But from the outside, normality continued performing itself perfectly. That illusion held until late into the evening. Then something changed. Nobody knows the exact sentence spoken first. Nobody knows whether the argument began suddenly or had been simmering quietly for hours beneath forced calmness. What detectives do know is this. At some point during the night, Phoenix's fitness tracker recorded a dramatic spike in physical activity. Not exercise, distress. Her heart rate surged violently. Movement intensified. Then chaos erupted inside the apartment. A neighbor would later report hearing noises through the walls. Disturbance, movement, sounds difficult to fully identify at the time. The kind of sounds people rationalize afterward because human beings instinctively avoid imagining horror close to home. But investigators believe those noises may have captured the beginning of the attack itself. What happened next was not quick, and that fact horrified detectives most of all. Evidence later revealed an extreme level of violence inflicted upon Phoenix inside the apartment. Multiple stab wounds, repeated attacks. Frenzied force far beyond what investigators typically associate with impulsive violence. This wasn't a single explosion lasting seconds. The attack escalated, continued, transformed. Forensic analysts would later conclude that strangulation also occurred during the assault, an especially disturbing detail in violent homicide investigations because strangulation is deeply personal, intimate, sustained. It requires proximity, control, pressure maintained long enough for the victim to understand exactly what is happening. And somewhere during those terrifying final moments, Phoenix realized a man she trusted completely was no longer emotionally reachable. The person attacking her was no longer behaving rationally. Yet the violence still didn't stop. Investigators later uncovered evidence suggesting mutilation occurred after death. That revelation shifted the psychological profile of the crime into something even darker, because overkill in homicide often reveals emotional frenzy. But post-mortem mutilation suggests something more psychologically disturbing, a complete collapse of empathy combined with profound emotional detachment from the victim's humanity. It raised horrifying questions for investigators. What was happening inside Ewan's mind during those moments? Was this uncontrolled rage, resentment, possession, hatred? Or had something inside him fractured so completely that Phoenix ceased becoming a person to him at all? The apartment itself became a frozen map of violence. Blood in the hallway, blood in the bathroom, weapons abandoned across rooms, signs of attempted cleanup, mixed with utter psychological collapse. And perhaps the most chilling detail of all, at some point after the killing ended, silence returned to the apartment, the same apartment where they had eaten dinner together only hours earlier, the same apartment where Phoenix had laughed, texted her mother, and continued imagining a future she would never get to live. Outside, life continued normally. Cars passed beneath streetlights. People slept peacefully nearby. Phones buzzed with ordinary conversations. Nobody realized that inside the top-floor flat, a 21-year-old woman lay dead while the man responsible remained alone beside her body. But the horror was only beginning, because investigators would soon discover something almost impossible to comprehend psychologically. Ewan Methven did not immediately call police. He stayed for 2 full days, and what he did during those 48 hours will become one of the most deeply disturbing aspects of the entire case. Because the most horrifying part of this story happened after Phoenix was already dead. When the violence ended, the apartment should become a place of panic. That's what investigators expected when they first heard the emergency call days later. Shock, fear, remorse, chaos, anything human. Instead, what they uncovered inside Ewan Methven's movements over the next 48 hours felt cold, surreal, almost impossible to emotionally process. Because after murdering Phoenix Spencerhorn, he did not flee immediately. He stayed beside her body. For 2 days, 2 full rotations of daylight and darkness passed while Phoenix lay dead inside the apartment. And during that time, the man responsible behaved with a level of emotional detachment that deeply disturbed even experienced detectives. At first, investigators wondered whether the scene pointed toward psychological collapse, some kind of breakdown, a mind disintegrating under the weight of catastrophic violence. Then they reconstructed his actions minute by minute, and the theory began falling apart. Because people experiencing genuine, uncontrollable psychosis rarely behave with organized deception. Ewan did. That contradiction became central to the investigation. In the hours after the killing, he cleaned parts of the apartment, not thoroughly enough to erase evidence, but enough to suggest awareness. Awareness of what he had done. Awareness of consequences. He moved through rooms containing horrific violence with chilling functionality. Then he left the apartment. Not to surrender, not to seek help, to continue living. That detail horrified Phoenix's. Love one's more than almost anything else. CCTV footage and digital evidence later revealed Ewan driving Phoenix's car through town while her body remained inside the flat. He visited stores, purchased items. existed publicly among ordinary people carrying the secret of unimaginable violence hidden just beneath the surface. And nobody around him knew. That's one of the most terrifying realities about predatory violence. Sometimes monsters stand in checkout lines beside everyone else. Calm, normal, invisible. But the psychological horror deepened further once investigators examined Phoenix's phone. Because while her family desperately believed she was alive, someone was still responding to messages. Her mother continued receiving texts, small, ordinary replies. The kind daughters send every day without thinking. Sorry, just woke up XXX. Love you. Tiny fragments of artificial normality, carefully designed to buy time. Except Phoenix never wrote them. Investigators later determined the messages had been sent after her death by Ewan, and that revelation transformed the emotional gravity of the case completely. Because impersonating a murder victim requires something deeply disturbing psychologically. It means the killer is capable of compartmentalizing the humanity of the person they destroyed while simultaneously exploiting the emotional trust of grieving family members. Phoenix's mother believed she was speaking to her daughter. In reality, she was unknowingly texting the man who had already killed her. Detectives later described his behavior as profoundly manipulative, not impulsive panic, but calculated emotional deception. And the longer the timeline unfolded, the darker it became. Investigators uncovered evidence that Ewan spent extended periods consuming pornography after the murder. That detail shocked the public because it introduced a horrifying emotional contradiction. A young woman lay mutilated inside the apartment, and nearby, the man responsible appeared capable of detaching himself enough to seek stimulation, distraction, even pleasure. Experts analyzing violent offenders often point toward emotional dissociation in cases like this, the ability to psychologically separate oneself from the moral weight of horrific actions. But detectives privately questioned something even more disturbing. Was this detachment practiced long before the murder itself? Because emotionally healthy people do not transition from intimate homicide to casual routine behavior without profound psychological abnormality. The apartment itself slowly transformed during those 2 days. The smell intensified. Neighbors reportedly noticed something unusual in the building. Strange odors drifting through shared spaces, not immediately identifiable, but wrong enough to linger in memory afterward. And still, Ewan delayed calling police. Why? That question haunted investigators. If the killing truly resulted from a sudden, uncontrollable breakdown, why spend 2 days manipulating evidence and pretending Phoenix remained alive? Why use her phone? Why drive her car? Why attempt to continue functioning normally? Why reportedly attempt to obtain drugs during the aftermath? Each new discovery weakened the narrative of temporary insanity and strengthened something far more sinister: conscious awareness. Forensic evidence would later play a critical role, dismantling Ewan's claims of psychological blackout. Crime scene analysts identified patterns inconsistent with total mental disconnection. Actions after the killing demonstrated sequencing, decision-making, concealment behaviors, delayed reporting. The evidence suggested he understood exactly what happened, and perhaps even more disturbing, he understood how horrifying it was, yet still chose deception over immediate confession. Psychologists studying domestic homicide often emphasize a terrifying truth. Some offenders experience violence not as a complete loss of control, but as a catastrophic climax of long-building resentment, dependency, entitlement, and emotional instability. The violence explodes. Then self-preservation returns. That pattern appeared disturbingly visible here, because during those 48 hours, Ewan Methven behaved less like a man disconnected from reality, and more like someone attempting to emotionally outrun what he had done. But there was nowhere left to run inside that apartment. Phoenix's body remained there, silent, waiting. The messages stopped feeling believable. Questions intensified. And eventually, even Ewan himself seemed to understand the illusion was collapsing around him. The smell, the evidence, the silence inside the flat, all of it closing inward. Then came the moment that still unsettles people who study this case. After 2 days of lies, after impersonating Phoenix, after moving through society carrying the secret of her death, Ewan Methven finally picked up the phone. And in a calm voice that sounded almost emotionally empty, he told police, "I think I killed my girlfriend." The dispatcher initially believed she was dealing with confusion, possibly intoxication, possibly mental illness, possibly another domestic disturbance spiraling out of control. Then the caller calmly said something that changed the atmosphere inside the control room instantly. "I think I killed my girlfriend." No panic, no trembling, just a flat, emotionally muted sentence delivered with the same tone someone might use to report a broken appliance. Investigators would later replay that call repeatedly, searching for something human inside his voice. Shock, regret, fear, anything. Instead, they found emotional emptiness. The operator asked where his girlfriend was. Inside the apartment, he explained, dead. The dispatcher attempted to gather more information, but the conversation grew increasingly surreal. Ewan Methin spoke in detached fragments, at one point suggesting he had experienced some sort of psychotic break. Yet even that explanation sounded strangely rehearsed, as though he was already attempting to psychologically distance himself from responsibility. Outside, police vehicles accelerated through rain-soaked streets toward the apartment block in East Kilbride, while dispatchers remained on the line with him. And then came another deeply unsettling realization. He had waited 2 days to make the call. 2 days. That detail changed the emotional temperature of the investigation immediately. Officers responding to impulsive killings often expect chaotic timelines, immediate confessions, frantic behavior, suicide attempts, emotional collapse. But delay introduces calculation. Delay introduces awareness. By the time police reached the building, detectives already understood they were walking into something psychologically abnormal. The apartment door opened into silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of aftermath. Experienced investigators often describe certain crime scenes as emotionally oppressive before a single body is discovered. The air feels wrong. Stillness itself begins communicating violence. This apartment carried that feeling. The smell hit officers first. Heavy, sweet, rotting. A scent so overpowering one officer reportedly had to steady himself before continuing deeper inside. Then came the hallway. Blood stained the floor in darkened streaks. Smears along walls. Signs of movement after catastrophic violence. Towels partially covering evidence that could no longer realistically be hidden. And at the center of it all lay Phoenix Spencerhorn. What remained of her. Detectives would later describe the scene as one of the most emotionally difficult discoveries of their careers. Not simply because of the violence itself, but because of the intimacy of it. This was not detached murder. It felt deeply personal, frenzied, dehumanizing. The injuries inflicted upon Phoenix revealed prolonged brutality far beyond what investigators associate with sudden panic. Multiple weapons were recovered nearby. Blood evidence extended across multiple areas of the apartment. Signs of post-mortem mutilation intensified the horror further. One detective would later admit the scene stayed with him long after the case ended. Not because he had never seen death before, but because the violence suggested something psychologically broken at a level difficult to comprehend. And then officers looked at Ewan, calm, not emotionless entirely, but disturbingly controlled considering the destruction surrounding him. There were no dramatic outbursts, no desperate denial, no visible collapse under the reality of what he had done. That contradiction deeply unsettled investigators. How does someone spend 48 hours beside a mutilated body, then speak to police with such eerie composure? The investigation quickly shifted toward understanding not only what happened, but who Ewan Methin truly was psychologically. Because the more detectives reconstructed his behavior, the more difficult it became to accept the idea of temporary insanity alone. His actions after the murder demonstrated organization, manipulation, concealment, awareness, the fake messages to Phoenix's mother, the movement of evidence, the delayed confession, the attempts to maintain appearances outside the apartment. None of it aligned neatly with total psychological disintegration. And perhaps most disturbing of all, Ewan himself occasionally appeared aware of the life he had just destroyed. At one stage after his arrest, while sitting inside a jail cell awaiting the consequences of what he'd done, he reportedly made a cold remark that investigators never forgot. I guess this is my next 25 years. Not, I killed her. Not, I destroyed a family. Not remorse. Just a detached acknowledgement of punishment, as though prison itself had become the central tragedy in his mind. That statement chilled detectives because it revealed something terrifying about emotional emptiness. Some violent offenders do not experience guilt the way ordinary people imagine guilt. They recognize consequences intellectually, while remaining emotionally disconnected from the suffering they caused, which raises an unbearable question. Had Ewan psychologically crossed that line long before the murder itself? Because by the time officers walked through that apartment door, Phoenix Spencer Horn was already gone, and standing nearby was a man who seemed capable of discussing unimaginable violence with almost clinical detachment. But investigators would soon discover something even more disturbing. Cases like this were not isolated horrors. They were part of a much darker pattern hiding beneath ordinary human faces. Long before detectives walked into that apartment in East Kilbride, another group of investigators had uncovered a different kind of horror hidden beneath another ordinary building in Scotland. A horror so disturbing it permanently changed the way police viewed predators who hide behind normality. This time, the smell came from a church. Not loud, not overwhelming at first, just strange enough to unsettle workers renovating the building. St. Patrick's Church in Glasgow has stood peacefully for decades, its aging chapel walls carrying the quiet atmosphere people associate with sacred places. Candles, prayer benches, echoes of hymns trapped inside old stone, a place people trusted, which made what investigators found underneath it feel almost evil in a way that transcended murder itself. Workers renovating part of the chapel noticed irregularities beneath the floorboards. The ground sounded hollow in places. Unnatural. Police were called. Then detectives descended beneath the church into darkness. What they discovered waiting underneath the chapel would trigger one of the most terrifying serial murder investigations in British criminal history. Buried beneath the floorboards was the body of a young woman, wrapped carefully, hidden deliberately, concealed beneath a religious building, while people worshipped overhead for years. The victim was 23-year-old Angelica Kluck, a student from Poland who had disappeared after working inside the church months earlier. At first, investigators hoped this might be an isolated killing committed by a local predator who panicked after the murder. Then they identified the man connected to the church caretaker quarters, Peter Tobin, or at least that's the name everyone believed belonged to him. Because one of the most chilling things about Peter Tobin was how effectively he reinvented himself throughout his life. New identities, new cities, new relationships, new jobs. He moved through society like a shadow constantly changing shape before suspicion could settle around him. And wherever he went, women disappeared. At first glance, Tobin looked unimpressive. Older, soft-spoken, religious at times, helpful around the church. The kind of man many people would instinctively dismiss as harmless within seconds of meeting him. That illusion became his greatest weapon. Detectives later realized Tobin understood trust better than most normal people ever will. He knew how to mirror kindness, how to appear vulnerable, how to present himself as safe enough to enter homes, relationships, communities. Predators like Tobin rarely survive through brute force alone. They survive through performance. And Peter Tobin performed normality for decades. As investigators searched the church property, they discovered something deeply unsettling hidden near the burial site. A concealed compartment beneath the floorboards, almost like a secret chamber designed specifically to hide evidence from the world above. That discovery changed everything psychologically, because hidden chambers imply preparation. Preparation implies repetition, and repetition suggests experience. Suddenly, detectives were no longer asking whether Peter Tobin killed Angelica Kluck. They were asking something far more terrifying. How many others were there? The deeper investigators looked into Tobin's past, the darker the pattern became. He had lived across multiple cities under shifting circumstances, repeatedly embedding himself into communities before abruptly relocating. Relationships ended violently. Women vanished near timelines connected to his movements. Yet somehow, for years, suspicion never fully landed on him. Why? Because serial predators often understand one horrifying truth about human psychology. Most people cannot emotionally imagine evil hiding behind ordinary behavior. That blind spot protects predators more effectively than weapons ever could. Neighbors remembered Tobin as quiet. Co-workers remembered him as strange, perhaps, but not monstrous. Even after Angelica's body was found, some people struggled to reconcile the image of the older church handyman with the reality investigators were beginning to uncover beneath the surface. But seasoned detectives recognized something disturbingly familiar in men like Tobin. Compartmentalization, the ability to separate horrific violence from outward routine. The same emotional contradiction investigators had seen in Ewan Methan. The same terrifying normality masking psychological darkness. And as police expanded the investigation into Peter Tobin's history, an unbearable realization slowly emerged inside briefing rooms across Scotland. Angelica Cluck was almost certainly not his first victim, which meant somewhere out there, hidden beneath decades of missing persons cases, unsolved disappearances, and forgotten grief, other bodies might still be waiting to be found. Detectives now feared something almost unimaginable. They weren't hunting a murderer anymore. They were hunting a serial predator who may have been hiding in plain sight for most of his life. Detective David Swindle had investigated violent men before. Predators, manipulators, sexual offenders capable of terrible things. But something about Peter Tobin unsettled him differently. It wasn't just a murder beneath the church floorboards. It was a feeling that investigators had only uncovered the surface layer of something much larger, something buried across decades and scattered throughout Britain under different names, different addresses, different identities. Swindle couldn't shake the instinct that Angelica Cluck was standing at the edge of a much darker graveyard. And instincts like that matter in homicide investigations, because experienced detectives learn to recognize patterns long before they can fully prove them. Peter Tobin carried too many contradictions, too many relocations, too many fractured relationships, too many women disappearing around the edges of his life. Most killers have emotional signatures, recurrent behaviors reflecting psychological compulsions they struggle to suppress. As investigators began dissecting Tobin's history, those signatures slowly started emerging from the shadows. Violence, control, manipulation, reinvention, again and again. That realization triggered one of the most ambitious cold case investigations in Scottish criminal history. Operation Anagram. The name itself sounded almost cryptic, fitting for a man who seemed to spend his life rearranging identities like letters in a puzzle nobody noticed until it was too late. And once the operation began, the scale of the nightmare started expanding rapidly. Detectives built timelines stretching back decades, mapping every known address Tobin had ever occupied. They cross-referenced missing persons cases, old assault allegations, unsolved murders, employment records, former relationships. The investigation became obsessive, because the deeper they dug, the more disturbing the coincidences became. Women vanished near locations connected to Tobin. Young girls disappeared during periods matching his movements across cities. Violent offenses surfaced near homes he once occupied under slightly altered identities. It felt less like investigating a single murderer, and more like excavating a hidden history of violence concealed inside ordinary British life. Then detectives uncovered another terrifying pattern. Peter Tobin rarely stayed anywhere too long. He drifted, town to town, job to job, relationship to relationship, predatory transients. Experts later noted this behavior is common among organized serial offenders who instinctively understand the danger of remaining geographically rooted. Mobility protects them. Reinvention protects them. Every new town offers fresh anonymity, and people unaware of the darkness left behind elsewhere. And Peter Tobin understood anonymity exceptionally well. To neighbors, he was often just the older handyman, the quiet man nearby, the church worker, the tenant, the boyfriend, never the predator. That's what allowed him to survive unnoticed for so long. Operation Anagram investigators eventually began reopening disappearances dating back decades. Families who had spent years trapped inside uncertainty suddenly received unexpected calls from detectives asking old questions again. Questions many feared would never be answered. Where was your daughter last seen? Who was she with? Did she mention an older man? Did she hitchhike? Did she trust people easily? Those interviews carried enormous emotional weight because every reopened case carried the possibility of devastating truth. And then came the discoveries. Buried remains. Human bones hidden beneath ground connected to Tobin's past. For investigators, each excavation became psychologically brutal. Search teams worked slowly through soil, while families waited nearby carrying decades of unresolved grief suspended between hope and horror. Then DNA entered the investigation. Advances in forensic science allowed detectives to connect fragments of evidence impossible to conclusively link years earlier. Fibers, biological traces, geographic timelines, historical witness statements suddenly aligned with terrifying clarity. The dead were beginning to speak again, and what they revealed horrified investigators. Victims separated by years, sometimes decades, now appear connected to the same predator, moving invisibly through ordinary life, a predator who had likely refined his methods through repetition. That realization fundamentally changed how detectives viewed Peter Tobin psychologically. This was no impulsive killer spiraling temporarily into violence. This was someone who appeared capable of compartmentalized predation over extraordinarily long periods of time, a man who could commit horrific acts, then calmly continue existing among normal people afterward. The emotional contradiction became increasingly difficult to comprehend. How do serial predators sit at dinner tables after burying bodies? How do they laugh casually with neighbors while families search desperately for missing daughters? How do they carry secrets so monstrous without collapsing under them? Operation Anagram investigators began believing Tobin may have been responsible for far more victims than police could ever conclusively prove. That possibility haunted the investigation constantly, because serial murder investigations are often shaped as much by absence as evidence. Missing files, degraded remains, lost witnesses, forgotten timelines, entire lives swallowed by time before connections can fully emerge. And Peter Tobin had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Some detectives feared the true number of victims might never be known. Others worried there were still undiscovered burial sites waiting somewhere beneath ordinary landscapes, gardens, basements, abandoned properties silently holding evidence of forgotten murders. The scale of uncertainty became terrifying. At one stage, investigators reportedly examined hundreds of possible links across Britain. Hundreds, which raises a deeply unsettling question. How many killers move invisibly through society simply because nobody connects the patterns quickly enough? Operation Anagram stopped being just an investigation. It became a hunt through buried history itself, a psychological excavation into the mind of a predator who appeared capable of living multiple lives while leaving devastation scattered behind him across decades. And then investigators uncovered details so disturbing even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to emotionally process them. The Earth gave nothing away at first. For years, it kept its silence like a loyal accomplice, holding on to secrets that families refused to let go of. But silence has a way of cracking under time, under pressure, under the relentless refusal of love to accept absence as truth. When the first remains were uncovered, it did not feel like discovery. It felt like a confession the ground had been forced to make after holding its breath for too long. Vicky Hamilton was one of them. Her name, once spoken in desperate searches and fading posters, had become something else over the years. A whisper, a question that grew heavier every time it went unanswered. And now, finally, there was proof that she had not simply vanished into nothing. She had been taken, hidden, buried away from the world that never stopped looking for her. The confirmation did not bring peace. It brought weight, a crushing realization that every year of hope had been sitting on top of something far darker than imagination had ever allowed. And then came Dina McNichol, another name pulled back from uncertainty and placed into the harsh light of truth. Another daughter, another life reduced to a recovery site marked by tape and quiet instructions. The distance between their disappearances and their discovery stretched across decades. Yet in that moment, time collapsed. Two young lives, separated in life, now connected only by the same buried ending. For the families, the years did not fade. They accumulated. Every birthday without an answer, every empty chair at the table, every phone call that was never made but still somehow expected. Hope, in its most painful form, had kept them suspended in a reality where grief could not fully begin because certainty had never arrived. Now it had, and it was worse than anything they had imagined. Detectives who had worked the case for years stood over the sites with expressions they could not hide. This was not just closure. It was exposure. Exposure to a level of patience and violence that felt almost incomprehensible. The killer had not rushed. He had stored, preserved, moved through his life knowing exactly what lay hidden beneath the surface of ordinary places. It wasn't just what he had done. It was how long he had lived beside it. There was something deeply unsettling in the realization that the bodies had been transported, relocated, concealed with deliberate care. This was not chaos. This was control. Each movement suggested planning. Each burial suggested time spent thinking, revisiting, ensuring nothing would surface too soon. And still, he had blended into the world. Neighbors remembered nothing unusual. Routine greetings, ordinary presence, a man who existed in the background of life. Never loud enough to draw attention, never strange enough to trigger suspicion. That was what made the truth so difficult to absorb. Evil had not announced itself. It had simply continued, quietly, patiently, hidden behind the most familiar face imaginable. As investigators pieced together the pattern, a darker question began to form in the spaces between facts. Why stop there? The locations, the timeline, the gaps in recorded movement, none of it felt complete. It carried the uncomfortable shape of something unfinished, as if these two discoveries were not endpoints, but interruptions, like opening chapters in a book that had far more pages missing than present. Families listened to updates they had waited a lifetime to hear, but even answers came with fractures. There was relief, yes, but it was buried under something heavier. The recognition that love had outlasted certainty, and certainty had arrived only after it no longer mattered in the way it once could have. At the recovery sites, forensic teams worked with a kind of quiet reverence, aware that every fragment they handled represented years of stolen time. Not just lives lost, but decades of not knowing, decades of imagining every possible ending except the one that had been true all along. And through it all, detectives could not shake the same thought. This level of concealment, this patience, this consistency over years. It did not feel like the work of someone who had stopped. It felt like someone who had simply not been fully found yet. Because even as two names were finally returned to history, the pattern they revealed hinted at something far more unsettling beneath the surface. Something still unaccounted for. Something waiting in the spaces between confirmed answers. And even in prison, even after decades had passed, even after the truth had begun to surface piece by piece, there was one question that never stopped pressing against the minds of those who investigated him. But even prison could never answer the one question detectives still asked. The question never leaves a room after cases like this end. It lingers in the silence investigators carry home, in the pause between sentences, in the way they stare at files long after they've already closed them. Not because the case is unsolved, but because it is solved and still somehow makes no sense. What creates something like this? What turns a human life into a method, into a pattern of concealment, into a mind capable of living beside buried truths for years without breaking? Psychologists often describe predators like this not as chaos, but as control. Control disguised as calm. Control hidden behind normal routines, polite conversation, even charm. The most unsettling part is never violence itself. It is the discipline that surrounds it, the ability to switch between worlds without letting either one collide. There were no obvious signs that stood out in hindsight. That is what haunts investigators the most. No single moment where everything could have been stopped with certainty. Instead, there were fragments, small inconsistencies, emotional detachment in places where empathy should have been, a strange comfort in secrecy, an ability to observe others without being fully seen in return. But fragments are never enough when they are still scattered in real time. Only after everything is revealed do they begin to look like warnings. And even then, they feel disturbingly ordinary. The human mind struggles with that kind of truth. It prefers monsters to be visible. It wants them marked by obvious cruelty, by instability, by something that clearly separates them from everyone else. But cases like this destroy that comfort. Because what emerges instead is adaptation, the ability to blend, to perform normalcy so convincingly that suspicion never has a surface to attach itself to. For the families, that realization is the hardest to carry. It is one thing to lose someone to a monster you could imagine. It is something entirely different to learn that the line between safety and danger was never where you thought it was. That evil did not arrive from outside the world, but existed within it, walking the same streets, speaking the same language, occupying the same spaces of ordinary life. And so the grief becomes layered, not just grief for the lives taken, but grief for every moment that might have been different, every glance that went unexamined, every instinct that was too quiet to be heard above the noise of normalcy. It creates a loop the mind cannot exit, a question that never resolves because it has no fixed answer. Could this have been prevented? Detectives who work the case carry that question differently. For them, it is not abstract. It is personal. They revisit timelines not to change what happened, but to search for the moment where reality could have split in another direction. Yet every path they follow leads back to the same place. A man who knew how to remain unseen until it was too late. That is what changes them. Not just the violence, but the precision of concealment. The awareness that someone can live a life so carefully divided that even proximity does not guarantee detection. Over time, something else begins to settle in, a quieter fear, one that does not belong only to the past. Because if one person could do this while appearing ordinary, the question becomes unavoidable. How many others are still doing the same? How many smiles are covering calculations no one has yet uncovered? How many lives are currently moving through the world unnoticed, not because they are harmless, but because they are practiced at looking exactly like everyone else? This is where the case stops being history and starts becoming something more uncomfortable, something reflective, something that follows people out of the video and into their own understanding of the world around them. The victims, in the end, become more than names tied to discovery. They become reminders of what was lost in the gap between truth and recognition. Lives full of direction, possibility, and futures that were never allowed to unfold. Their absence is not only measured in years, but in everything those years would have contained. And even for the investigators who have seen the darkest corners of human behavior, there's a weight that never fully leaves. Because solving a case does not erase what it revealed. It only makes it permanent. There is no comfort in finality like this, only acceptance mixed with unease, the understanding that justice, while necessary, does not undo the shape of what happened. It only frames it. And when everything is stripped back, when all the evidence is closed and all the answers are placed on record, one truth remains heavier than the rest. Monsters are not always born in shadows. Sometimes they are formed in plain sight, in the spaces no one thinks to question, in the moments everyone assumes are safe. And they do not always announce themselves. Some killers hunt in darkness. Others smile, shake your hand, and wait for the right moment to become monsters.